Feel like I know a thing or two about finding what works best for you in terms of how to study. My qualifications, baby, I have failed uncontrollably. I have seen every letter in the alphabet except for A, B, and C up until now. Today we are going to be talking about, honestly, one of my most asked questions. How do I study in medical school? I have had so much trial and error when it comes to finding a study method that works best for me. For those who follow me on TikTok, you guys know that I struggled immensely my first year of medical school. My first and second semester I had to take, first and second semester I failed both of those semesters, and in order to move on to the next semester I had to take remediation exams. So I took 2 remediation exams to get to where I am today, which is a second year medical student. But those remediation exams were 200 questions comprehensive of everything that was taught over the semester. And if I could really sum up the reasons as to why it got to the point where I was just failing uncontrollably, it was honestly because I just didn't know how to study best for myself. Now, when I say failing, I definitely wasn't like failing in the 40s and 50s. I was like high 50s, late 60s, depending on the exam. But most times, like on most of my assessments, I was failing with like high 60s and stuff like that. And this was all pre ADHD diagnosis, which I will talk a little bit more about later. But I just want to give you my qualifications. Baby, I have failed uncontrollably. I've failed. I have seen every letter in the alphabet except for A, B, and C in medical school up until now. Now I'm seeing those A's, those B's, and those C's. Okay, honey? So I feel like I know a thing or two about finding what works best for you in terms of how to study. I do want to preface by saying what works for me may not work for you. So take everything that I say with a grain of salt, try it out if it does help, and then if it doesn't, you know, look for other avenues. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. Before we begin, I do want to talk about my diagnosis, my ADHD diagnosis, that I feel like has made a tremendous I don't even know the word that I'm looking for, but that has made the biggest difference. That's the word I'm looking for. That has made the biggest difference in my studies and how I study, because I did not realize like how unfocused and how clogged up my mind was when I was studying. So I got diagnosed with ADHD a couple of months ago. I would say May 2024 is when I got diagnosed with ADHD. How I even got to that diagnosis is I have a friend who I would study with a lot, especially my first and second semester. And he would ask me like, do I have ADHD? And I was like, no. And he was like, well, I think you may need to like go see about that, because you literally act the exact same way that I act when I am off my meds trying to study. He noticed that I would pick up my phone a lot. He noticed that like I would get easily distracted and it would take me longer to get back focused and stuff like that. So I always deemed that behavior as me just like needing a break or me just having trouble. I knew it was like trouble focusing, but I never thought it was like a chemical imbalance. So I went to our school psychiatrist to see about it, and she just said, okay, well, I think you just have like a really bad anxiety problem, like testing anxiety problem, which was nothing new to me because I knew that I had an anxiety issue as of like 2019 when I was like a college junior or senior or whatever. So anxiety, like being told I had anxiety was nothing like new. So I just thought, okay, maybe it is just anxiety. But then I started to do a little bit more research and pay a lot more attention to myself, and I was like, like maybe I do fit into this ADHD category. However, I'm not like hyperactive. I am a very like extroverted person, but I would not categorize that as hyperactive. And I also do remember my mom saying, like, as a kid that I was really smart, but I just really needed to sit down and like focus, and you know, I would get stuff. But again, I never like attributed that to like having ADHD or being hyperactive or whatever. So I went to my school psychiatrist again, and she was just like, yeah, no, I think you just have like a really bad like anxiety issue or whatever, but if you know you continue to feel like it might be something more, then I'll bring you back in and I'll ask you more questions. So at this point, I'm just like, I'm just gonna go to my PCP at home and see what she says, because I feel like going back to the same person, she just keeps seeing the same thing. So I'm just gonna go to my PCP at home, and if my PCP says it's anxiety, you don't have ADHD, you need to mitigate these issues or whatever, then I'll believe it and I'll work on it, right? So over the summer, went back home, went to my PCP. My PCP gave me a survey, or like a form to fill out, and I made sure to fill out the form to as honestly as possible, because I didn't want, because I was failing so much, I felt like I needed an explanation. Like I feel like I was longing for a diagnosis of something other than anxiety, because I know I'm anxious, but I was longing for a diagnosis, or just to be told like you're okay, because I was failing. And it's not as if I wasn't putting in the work. Like I was studying like 10, 12, 11, however many hours a day. So it wasn't even like I wasn't putting in the work. It wasn't even like I was distracted by anything outside. Like, yes, I would be posting on TikTok, but it's not like I was spending all my time on TikTok. It's not like I was spending all my time on Instagram. At the time, I wasn't even on YouTube. So it wasn't as if there were any other outside factors. I wasn't in a relationship. Like my friendships at the time were, you know, fine. So I just felt like I needed like an explanation. I needed to understand like, why do I keep failing? So I just decided, if I go to my PCP and she's just like, you know what, you don't have ADHD, is something else, then you know, I would come to terms with it and I would figure it out. So she gave me a form, a survey or whatever. I filled it out. It just asked me a whole bunch of questions, and I filled it out as honestly as possible, because although I was looking for an answer, I did not want to give myself the wrong answer, if that makes any sense. Like I didn't want to fill it out in such a way where it made it look like I had ADHD when I didn't. So after filling out the form, she looked at it and she was just like, yeah, you for sure have ADHD. And I was like, really? And she was like, yeah, like just looking at the form and how you answered the questions, like you for sure have ADHD. And she continued to ask me a couple more questions just to kind of like confirm. But I kid you not, like being told like, girl, okay, your brain is a little imbalanced and that's probably why you're struggling, almost like lifted a weight off my shoulder, because it allowed me to be a little less hard on myself, if that makes any sense, because I understood like it's not like entirely, it's nothing that you are doing. You're doing everything. It's just the fact that your brain needs a little bit more help in terms of focusing. And in terms of my symptoms, I would always say that I just felt like I had 1,000,001 things going on in my head all at once. And I thought that was because I just had a lot going on, but it's abnormal to have a bajillion things going on at once. And all of these things would be going on in my head while I'm studying. So it would make sense that I could be studying something for hours, but some of it is not even connecting, or it's like getting lost in the sauce of the 1,000,000,000 bajillion things that, you know, was in my head. So obviously, long story short, got diagnosed, was put on meds, and this was actually during the time that I was studying for my second remediation exam. So I was just like, okay, well, we're gonna see. I'm gonna take my meds, I'm gonna study for this remediation exam, and if I do, you know, if I pass this remediation exam, I will, obviously there's an issue. And obviously this was medicine or a diagnosis that I really needed and was true. I kid y'all not, the first time that I took my medication, y'all, I feel like I could hear colors. Like everything stopped. Like the best way that I could describe it is like life was just moving at a regular pace. I didn't feel rushed. My thoughts didn't feel rushed. And even if my thoughts were trying to bombard each other, like I could only think one thought at a time. And until I finished that thought, that was when I could finish the second thought. So when I started to study and I was able to, I feel like everything that I was studying, although like it's not like a magic pill where you take it and then you study something one time and it just enters your brain, it just I feel like I was able to absorb more. And by the second time I came back and looked at something, like I was just, because I absorbed so much the first time, like it was easier for me to reabsorb and start to understand and stuff like that. So my ADHD diagnosis, I will say, I feel like regardless of the study methods that I implemented and have been working for me, I think that my ADHD diagnosis definitely provided a lot more clarity for me while studying, and also provided a lot more clarity as to why studying sometimes or focusing sometimes can be so difficult, and what a detriment that is to my academic success. So my ADHD diagnosis and being medicated, along with all of the study methods that I now have implemented, I feel like is definitely like the recipe for success for me. I will say, like, I cannot diagnose you with ADHD. I will just encourage you, if you feel like we share similar symptoms, or if you felt like, you know, off of research and stuff like that, like maybe you could have ADHD, I just encourage you to go to your doctor, talk to your PCP, and, you know, talk to them and see what they say. So my first semester of medical school, I had the mindset of I don't need to go to lecture, I don't need to watch the lectures. The professors read off of the PowerPoints anyway, so I'm just going to read the PowerPoints myself and teach everything to myself using supplemental information or supplemental aids and resources. That was probably like the stupidest idea that I had ever had in all of the time that I spent in medical school. That was the beginning of my downfall, because I noticed, or I started to realize closer to the end of my second semester, that you need to know the lectures like the back of your hand, especially if your exams and quizzes are written by your professors. So in medical school, you either have in-house exams or you have NBME style exams. NBME is like a standardized type of exam where your school is able to pick out questions from a standardized bank. This bank is comprised of old USMLE questions, and your school has access and they can use these questions to test you, you know, while you are in medical school. And then you have in-house exams that are written by the professors that are teaching you at your school. At my school, everything is written in-house, the quizzes and the exams, up until semester 5. Semester 5, I believe you are doing NBME style exams. But everything is written in-house. So the first mistake that I made was not watching the lectures and knowing the lectures like the back of my hand. Now, I do want to add a little note that, do I watch every single lecture that is lectured by my professors? No. And the way that I'm able to figure out what lectures I need to watch and what lectures I can skip and just read by myself, but continuously keep going over it, is by watching a new lecturer at least one time or at least twice. By the time I watch the lecturer, by the end of the first lecture, or honestly even by the middle of the first lecture, I am able to denote whether or not watching their lecture is beneficial to me. Now, what does beneficial for me sound like or look like or whatever? Beneficial for me is I'm watching your lecture and I feel like you, as the professor, you are explaining or expanding upon the subject matter that is on the lecture slide. Because the reason why I had this mentality of I don't need to watch the lecture, I'm just going to read the lectures for myself, is because I always had this belief that a lot of professors just read straight off of the slide, which sometimes is true, but other times it's not, depending on the professor. Some professors, yes, they have words on the slides. However, when they explain, they bring those words on the lecture slides to life, and it makes it so much easier for you to understand and grasp the subject matter. So I will always at least watch a new lecturer at least one time, just to see whether or not they are expanding upon the lecture matter that is on the lectures, that's going to help me, understand better. Or if the lecturer is the type of lecturer that I notice that they point out exactly what they want you to know. Because another thing is that I got very highlight happy. I was deeming what I believed was important in my first semester, when you can't do that, because you're not the person that is writing the exam, you're not the person that's writing the quiz, you're not the professor. So only the professor can dictate what is important and what is not. So if I feel like after the first time I watch a professor and I feel like they're the type that points out exactly what they want you to know, or points out all of the important factoids that isn't bolded or is bolded and they expand upon, those are the types of lecturers that I will continue to watch as the block goes on. Now, the lecturers that I do not watch, the professors that I do not watch, are the ones that are literally reading from the slide. And in order to help me not to make the mistake of already deeming a professor of just reading off the slide, if I watch a professor the first time and already maybe 25-30 minutes in, I'm just like, ooh, I feel like they're reading off the slide, what I will do is I will completely watch the lecture and then I'll watch another one of their lectures. If by 30 minutes into the second lecture they are in fact reading from the slide, I just decide, okay, they're reading from the slide, I went to school, I can read for myself, this is the type of lecture that I am going to read over the slides myself. There are moments in time where I might be reading off the slide and I'm just like, I don't understand, this isn't really clicking or whatever. Those are the times that I will either go back to the lecture and maybe just watch that specific part, or I will utilize other supplemental resources, which I will talk about later, that will help with, helping it click. So my second semester, I think I was about on the same wavelength of not really watching lecture, but I started to notice, or I started to realize that not watching lecture wasn't completely working. So I did go to watch lecture, and I would kind of, what I talked about in terms of deciding whether or not I would watch a lecture, I started to implement that during my second semester. And it wasn't until the end of my second semester that I realized that watching the lectures at least like twice. Like I started to force myself to watch the lectures because I felt as though I was missing information that was talked about, and I didn't want to miss that information anymore. So by the end of my second semester, I started to force myself to watch every single lecture twice. So the first time I would watch the lecture and I would take notes. The second time I would watch the lecture, and any notes that I did not take or I missed, I would take those notes, but then I would also begin to make like certain connections with the previous time that I watched the lecture. And that started to help me. I saw that there was an improvement with my last exam score in my second semester. Both semesters though, I did implement like a pass system, which I call like a lecture pass tracker, and you can actually have access to this in my Stan store. The link should be in my description box down below. But what I would do is create a lecture pass tracker, or a system where I would be tracking the number of times that I looked over or watched a lecture. So my standard pass tracker is 3 times. I will be honest, by the third time that I'm looking over a lecture, I probably know about 30% of that information. It is not until I look over a lecture like 4, 5, 6 times that I'm like, okay, like I'm getting to like 65, 70%. Once I feel like I'm at 70%, that's how I know like things are starting to click, and that's when I just need to start tying, you know, loose ends together to get me over like that 75, 80% threshold. So going over like my lecture pass tracker, basically it's a 3-pass system plus a quiz review and exam reviews. So my first pass is either me reading over the lecture myself or watching the lecture. And in my pass tracker, I will denote whether or not I felt great after watching it and it was just like something that just clicked. I will denote if it's something that I need to revisit, which is like 80% of the time I need to revisit like everything. And then I watched it and I don't know what the hell I just watched. I will put that in red so I know that is a lecture that I specifically need to pay attention to. And I continue to do that for all of my passes. By the time I get to like my quiz reviews or my exam reviews, that's when everything is starting to look green and I just kind of denote I feel better about it. I just need to memorize. For my exam reviews and my quiz reviews, I try to at least, by the time it gets to my quiz review, this is like probably like my 4th or 5th time looking at the lecture. And before a quiz or an exam, I like to make sure I have looked at every single lecture that has been taught in the entire block to see if there's any small details that I missed, just to re-go over things. And I've also realized that I am a very like photographic memory type of person. So between the notes that I make for myself and then also like looking over at the lectures again and again, sometimes when I'm seated at a quiz or an exam, I can see my own document or the lecture itself in my head and pinpoint exactly like where the answer is. I started using the lecture pass tracker for my first semester. I used it my second semester, and I've used it my third semester. So that I wouldn't say that that's something that has particularly like made me study better. I think that that's just something that has helped me keep myself organized through the last like 1.5 years that I've been in medical school. I think that's just a way of me keeping myself organized and making sure that I have some sort of like spaced repetition with the material. Let's talk about the study methods that I use now in my second year that have helped me make the greatest grades. The first thing that I do is make a word association document. It's like a study guide of everything from the block. And what I do is for instance, like we are in pathophysiology, pharmacology, and all that sort, right? So when it comes to the diseases or whatever, what I do is I'll have a blank document and I will put the disease like at the top and underline it. And every word that is associated with that disease, I write under it. So if I need to, if a specific like stain or something like that, or if a specific medication, or like a specific gross examination, specific microscopy or whatever is associated with that disease, I will write it under that disease, so that anytime that I'm doing practice questions, anytime that I am studying or whatever, I know that this disease, this drug, this subject or whatever is associated with these words. So anytime I see these words, it starts to ping in my head like, oh, it's probably this disease, oh, it's probably this drug or whatever. I have a pretty detailed explanation on my TikTok, which I will link the video, literally showing a document or whatever that I've made this semester. I will link it in the description box down below, so take a look at that video. And of course, if you ever have any more questions, like, feel free to reach out to me via DM. The next thing that I think a study method that has really worked for me is repetition, and this kind of goes back to my past tracker, my lecture past tracker, that kind of is like, although it is for organization, it kind of builds in a spaced repetition. I realized the second time that I was doing my remediation exam that repetition works so well for me. Like, seeing something over and over and over again helps me so much. That kind of goes back to like my photographic memory as well, because seeing something a whole bunch of times and connecting it with your, like, with an image or whatever in your mind helps me remember. Another thing that also helps me a lot is doing practice questions. So whether that's from the professors or whether that's from any of the supplemental resources that I utilize, practice questions really does help, because it allows me to see the different ways that a disease, or the different ways that this subject matter can be presented in a question. Last thing that I use when studying is supplemental resources. So the supplemental resources that I use are First Aid, Picmonic, Boards and Beyonds, Boot Camp, and then right now, since we're in like pathology and stuff like that, I have a book that's called Robbins and something like review or whatever. So I also use any supplemental resources that I find on YouTube. The channels that I like the best are Cram the Pants, Dirty Medicine. I think those are really the only two channels that I go back to if they do have like any videos that are of use to me. All of these supplemental resources, do I use them all at the same time? No. I use them as I deem necessary. The ones that I usually, for the most part, stick beside for sure, like every single block I utilize it, is First Aid. I definitely use First Aid for sure, and then everything else kind of like ebbs and flows. It's just dependent upon what I need. So for instance, like Picmonic, I like it because they are like, it's visual and it gives you like a very quick review. So those are the types of things that I like to use, like when I'm preparing for an exam or like a quiz and I just need to quickly review something like the night before or something like that. Boot Camp is also very great. I like to utilize that as a review resource as well, but sometimes I like to use it as like my first line type of supplemental resource, where after I review a lecture, I go and I like watch a video on that subject so that I have a clearer understanding. Again, right now we're in pathology, so Pathoma is also another supplemental resource that I use. I don't use that all the time, but for instance, right now we are in our GI block. The people them know I hate GI for sure. I just think our professors, the way they put it together is just so disorganized. They don't give a damn about us and they just like threw everything at us. But Pathoma is a great resource for pathology because it's just very straight to the point and stuff like that. I stopped using it for my last 2 blocks, but I definitely used it for my first block, and I'm definitely going to use it for my GI block right now. But I really like it. Really just I go back and forth between the supplementals, but I promise you the one that I use for sure every block is first aid, because first aid, and if you don't know what first aid is, let me show you. This is first aid, okay? Very thick book. You'll see a lot of medical students use this when they're preparing for STEP, but also a lot of medical students like to use it while they are in their preclinical sciences because it is a great tool to help, you know, make everything concise. It gives good mnemonics and stuff like that, and it just covers all the high yield information. So I utilize first aid for everything, and then every other supplemental resource that I mentioned, I kind of work it in. One thing that I will say though is a mistake that I made prior, like in my first and second semester, is that number one, I was over reliant on supplemental resources. The thing that you have to understand about supplemental resources, especially like with medical school, is they are all targeted for USMLE STEP prep. So they are covering all of the high yield information that you need to know for your first board exam, which can be a little tricky because when you are taking in-house written exams, your professors might be covering some of the nitty-gritty details that is not covered in a lot of these supplemental resources that a lot of medical students use. So I always tell people, use the supplemental resources, but always go back to your lecture, because at the end of the day, the questions for your exam, your quiz, and all of that, if you are at an institution that writes their exams in-house, all of the questions and everything is gonna be from that lecture slide. So use the supplemental resource as supplement, not as like Bible, if that makes any sense. Another mistake that I made in terms of how I study now versus how I studied then is I was doing a lot more practice questions. I will not lie, my first year of medical school. I think by the time I got to a quiz or an exam, I probably would have like busted through like 500 plus like practice questions, which sounds insane, but trust me, it's easy to bust through 500 something questions. And then versus now, I don't really find myself doing a lot of practice questions. I think because like my first year, I was so heavily reliant on practice questions to teach me. As opposed to now, like I don't rely on the practice questions to teach me. I use that as a form of testing my knowledge and seeing where my gaps and holes are. So I think that's definitely a difference between like how I still carried over some of the same of my study method from beforehand. However, the way that I utilize that study method is very different, especially when it comes to like my supplemental resources for sure, and my practice questions. Those are two things in my study method that I used my first year that I still currently use, but it's just the way in which I use them that's different, and I feel like that's what's making the difference. That's how I study in medical school. If you feel like I didn't cover anything, or if you ever have, you know, if you feel like you have more questions about how I study, definitely leave them in the comments down below and I will do my best to answer them. Or I could definitely do a part 2 if I feel like I need to expand upon anything. But thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.